loopholes enable Russia to sell crude oil to countries such as India, China, and Turkey. They're legally able to refine this into diesel, jet fuel, and other oil products that then are sold to sanctioning countries such as the UK, EU, and USA. So that sanctions have had an effect. They have failed in the sense of they haven't disabled Russia's ability to finance the war in Ukraine.
700 billion euros. My next guest says that's how much money Russia has been making from its fossil fuel sales since the beginning of its war with Ukraine, and that despite a raft of sanctions against it. And he also says that figure should be much lower. But how? Isaac Levi joins me now from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air in London. Isaac, welcome. 700 billion euros, that seems like an awful lot, but what should it be?
Well, Russia's enabling its financing of the war through its exports of fossil fuels. It's an economy that's incredibly reliant on the sale of fossil fuels. Previously, before the war, about half of all the tax revenues that Russia earned came through the export of fossil fuels, such as oil being the largest, gas and coal as well. And we've seen that they've earned around 700 billion euros, as you mentioned, since the start of the invasion, which is, of course, far too much. As you know, the West has imposed sanctions on Russia, which have had a positive effect at reducing Russia's export revenues from fossil fuels. We estimate at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air that this has cut their export revenues from fossil fuels by around 12%, or 3.4 billion euros per month. So there has been a positive effect. However, with further sanctions that we recommend, this could be 32% lower, cutting their export revenues by almost 7 billion euros per month. So the way that Russia's been able to earn such high revenues from the export of fossil fuels have been through some of the loopholes in the current sanctions, which half of them are legal. For example, the ways that the loopholes enable Russia to sell crude oil to countries such as India, China, and Turkey. They're legally able to refine this into diesel, jet fuel, and other oil products that then are sold to sanctioning countries such as the UK, EU, and USA. So this is one way where Russia is enabling its export revenues to be higher from fossil fuels due to gaps in the sanctions.
But I guess I first want to ask, looking at this figure, because we don't really have an overall figure of what Western-led nations really wanted to do in terms of limiting Russian oil or fossil fuel sales. They didn't really put a dollar figure on that. Should we say, and we'll get into the details in just a moment, but can we say that sanctions have failed in a sense, or are they just not as sharp as they could be? How would you appraise that?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that sanctions have had an effect and they have hit Russia's export revenues to an extent. They have failed in the sense of they haven't disabled Russia's ability to finance the war in Ukraine, and they haven't hit their export revenues sufficiently as they had the potential to do so. And part of that is due to a lack of political will and a fear of energy prices rising. But part of that has been due to gaps in the sanctions that they've enabled. So, for example, gas flows freely into Europe. So there's some areas they just haven't imposed enough sanctions, as well as a lack of enforcement on those that they have imposed.
We know that Europe, for example, has always said that it's not going to put a cap on natural gas imports from Russia, that it was going to try and move away from it. You would argue that it's doing that too slowly, that the will is not there to move as fast as it could move?
Definitely. We have a few case studies that are quite interesting of countries that have perhaps bought more of these fossil fuels where it's legal to do so. So in the case of Bulgaria, they were given an exemption in the oil sanctions, and they increased their reliance on Russian oil from 70% to 90%. Actually, the exemption ended at the end of 2023, and they're now 0% reliant on Russian oil. And we haven't seen any price spikes as a result. So I think this is a real case study of how countries can wean themselves off Russian fossil fuels, but there needs to be that push or those bans that stop them from being able to buy fossil fuels from Russia.
Is there a pain threshold that you think that Western nations maybe aren't approaching enough, or that they've kept that threshold too low? Because obviously price is one of the concerns. You want to provide the cheapest amount of fuel, the cheapest amount of power generating fuel possible. Is it just that Western nations are saying we need to be able to accept a higher price to be able to avoid bringing in these Russian fossil fuels? Is that part of the issue?
Yeah, I believe that is. It's a good point that the EU fears price spikes, but I think these fears are sometimes unfounded. And without bans or plans to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, companies can buy more and more of the fossil fuels from Russia. We've seen that in the case of LNG, liquefied natural gas, which the EU has increased 15% in the first half of this year compared to last year. So without these bans, countries or companies will keep buying more of the Russian fossil fuels and increase their reliance on them. And that's a real risk, because what we've seen, for example, in the summer of 2022, when Putin cut the gas pipeline to Europe, there was an increase in gas household bills by over 200%. So by not kind of forcing countries to reduce their reliance on Russia, you leave yourself at the whims of those in the Kremlin that could be able to instigate higher price spikes on Europe, which would be more costly for them.
You also mentioned loopholes. In one of your studies, you looked at jet fuel coming into the UK and found that there were just a handful of refineries in India that were providing actually a good bit of jet fuel into the UK. How do you stop those flows? I believe you wrote in that report, if I'm right, that those were legal mechanisms. Everything was legally done, in a sense, at least from the refining to selling it into the UK. Where do you crack down on that? Is it on the distribution side? Is it on the refinery side, the consumer side? How do you stop that?
They would have to ban the imports of oil products, so jet fuel and whatnot, from those refineries that are using Russian crude. This would incentivize those refineries to get their feedstock crude oil from non-Russian supply. There's one case which is very simple. A refinery in India, which is part owned by a sanctioned Russian company, Rosneft. So therefore, the UK could just ban the importation of oil products from this refinery. We think that if there isn't a ban at the government level, we'll see increasing quantities as we've done so. So in the second year of the sanctions, we've seen an increase of oil products coming from those refineries using Russian crude, which is, sending a lot of money back to the Kremlin.
Is this just a case of the EU and its slow apparatuses trying to keep up, and the UK, we should mention, these kind of slow government apparatuses trying to keep up with a much faster, more slippery mechanism when it comes to the distribution of these products?
Yeah, I think it is one of the issues with sanctions, that they have been too slow. And sometimes the transition period to when they announce a ban and then the ban being implemented can take months. And we can touch on that, for example, in the case of this LNG transshipment ban. But I think there is a mechanism that is working a bit too slow to combat Russia and their ability to finance the war through the sales of fossil fuels. I personally believe it's an incredibly urgent issue, not just for energy security risks to Europe, but as the war goes on and each day that passes by, the EU sends more money to Russia financing this war.
How much of a dent can a reduction in flows toward the EU and other Western-led allies in this issue, how much can that put a dent in the global exports that we've seen when it comes to Russian fossil fuels? Because we know that, for example, China, Turkey, India, for example, they've all been importing more fossil fuel products as a response to these measures. Is it not like trying to squeeze a balloon? You try and restrict it in one area and then it just sort of grows in another.
Well, this is something that we have seen, and the volumes that used to be sold to Western countries have been relatively stable. Russia's export volumes have been relatively stable, but by forcing Russia to sell through new routes, on longer journeys perhaps, and encouraging countries to take on those supplies that used to go to the West, they have had to increase the discount they've offered to these new buyers such as China, India and Turkey. And that is where we've seen the majority of the dent in Russia's export revenues. There are specific examples, though, where I think Russia is particularly vulnerable to bans from the EU. For example, in the case of LNG. So LNG from Russia makes up about 5% of the EU's total gas consumption last year, but it made up about 50% of Russia's export revenues from this fossil fuel type. So again, this is an example where I believe the EU holds strong leverage in its ability to cut Russia's export revenues without harming itself too much.
We know that oil revenues also have made up traditionally a large part of Russia's budget, and that although Western-led, this alliance has essentially put an oil price cap on, I believe, a couple of years ago, that there are still carve-outs, for example, Hungary and Slovakia. How important have those carve-outs become when we look at the overall picture of imports?
Yeah, well, these carve-outs have enabled Russia to increase its export revenues and keep Russian oil flowing into those countries such as Hungary through those carve-outs and the sanctions that you mentioned. And the carve-outs were given to buy more time for these countries to slowly reduce their reliance on fossil fuels from Russia, replacing those with other sources. And I don't think we've seen enough from those countries to show progress in reducing reliance on Russia. For example, in the case of Hungary, we've seen that there's been about a 50% increase in the first half of 2024 from the imports of Russian oil via pipeline compared to those levels in 2021, the first half of 2021, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think those carve-outs are contributing to increased Russian export revenues, and we need to put more pressure on those countries.
You mentioned earlier the shadow fleet, something that we've also followed here at Deutsche Welle, that is this kind of slapdash kind of fleet of older, aging ships that Russia has put together to try and get around these sanctions, in particular this price cap put on oil by this Western-led alliance. Are these countries making progress in clamping down on this kind of fleet, or is the fleet itself facing more problems? That's also been an expectation, of course, given the age and the condition of a lot of these ships. What are we seeing right now?
Yeah, well, I will start probably with answering that question and saying that the shadow fleet is a real issue for two main reasons. One of them is these are old tankers that are often perhaps unsafe. They may not have passed their safety inspections. They carry dubious insurance that we don't know whether they have enough financial backing in the case of an oil spill to cover the cost of cleanup, which can be over €1 billion. So I would say that there's a real environmental risk, and without insurance, if there is a spill, we know that the cost will fall on the taxpayer of those coastal states, which would be huge. So there's the argument from the environmental angle, as well as the fact that by enabling Russia to transport more of its oil that doesn't have to comply with this oil price cap policy, they're able to sell it at whatever price they want. So it does help boost their export revenues. In terms of tackling the shadow fleet, this is a very tricky issue, but there are some measures that we have seen. I believe it was Thursday last week, the UK Prime Minister announced the sanctioning of 11 shadow tankers transporting Russian oil. And this is a good start because we have seen this measure of sanctioning shadow tankers constrict those vessels' ability to continue operating and transporting Russian oil. So we did a little study which showed that the 41 American sanctioned shadow tankers transported 90% less Russian oil in the most recent 3 months compared to the 3 months prior to them being added to the sanctions list. So this is something that we want to see enforcement agencies continue to do, and stopping those shadow tankers transport Russian oil through coastal state waters without sufficient insurance. That's another measure that we think is imperative.
All right, that's Isaac Levi with the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. Thank you very much.